the husband who never quite finished dying. The forgotten body beneath the house in the Appalachians. In the dark mountains of West Virginia, where fog hangs over the valleys like a funeral shroud and silence is heavier than stone, there existed a family whose secrets were buried deeper than any grave. This is not a story of ghosts or curses, but something far more disturbing. A tale of flesh and blood, of forbidden bonds that twisted a family tree beyond recognition, of a man who vanished but never truly left, and of a house that held more than memories beneath its rotting floorboards. What you are about to hear is the true account of the Pritchard family. A clan that lived in isolation for generations, bound by bloodlines so tangled that even death could not untangle them. This is a story that will make you question what happens when humanity is stripped away by mountains, poverty, and the suffocating weight of inbreeding that turned relatives into something else entirely. The year was 1987 when social worker Margaret Chen first drove down the muddy path leading to the Pritchard property in McDa County, West Virginia. The Appalachian Mountains rose around her like the walls of a prison, their peaks disappearing into a gray mist that never seemed to lift. She had been warned by the county office that the Pritchards were different, that they kept to themselves, that private workers had found the visits unsettling. But Margaret had worked in these mountains for 12 years, and she thought she had seen everything poverty and isolation could do to a family. She was wrong. The house appeared through the trees like a rotten tooth jutting from diseased gums. It was a structure that defied architectural logic, additions and repairs made over decades without plan or skill, creating a building that seemed to lean in multiple directions at once. The wooden boards were crusty with age and moisture, some missing entirely, revealing the darkness beneath like missing teeth in a skull. As Margaret stepped from her vehicle, the first thing that struck her was the smell. A thick, sweet odor of decay mixed with something else, something organic and wrong that made her stomach clench. The figures walked from the second porch. The woman, who Margaret would later learn was Dorlin Pritchard, age 42 but looking ستون, stood with her shoulders hunched forward, her face a landscape of premature aging, and something else, features that seemed slightly off-center, eyes set to for a board, a mouth that hung up, revealing gaps where teeth should have been. Beside her stood 2 children, though calling them children felt insufficient for what Margaret saw. The boy, Thomas, was 16 but had the physical development of someone much younger, his limbs thin and twisted, his head slightly too large for his body, tilted at an angle that suggested his neck muscles could not properly support its weight. The girl, Sir, 14, clutched her mother's stained dress with hands that had too few fingers, her eyes moving independently of each other as she tracked Margaret's approach. Margaret forced her professional smile, the one she had perfected over years of difficult visits. Good morning. I'm Margaret Chen from McDa County Social Services. I'm here for our scheduled appointment. Darling's response was slow, her words forming with difficulty, consonants blurred together. We've been expecting someone. Mommy said the government people always come eventually. The accent was thick Appalachian, but there was something else underneath, a hissing quality that suggested more than dialect. Margaret climbed the 3 steps to the porch, noting how each board crowned under her weight, how the entire structure seemed to sway slightly. May I come inside? I'd like to talk about happiness or going with the children. Make sure everyone has what they need. The interior of the house was dim, lit only by the weak daylight that filtered through windows covered in years of crime. The smell was stronger here, that sweet rotting odor mixed with unwashed bodies, mildew, and something underneath that Margaret could not identify. Something that made the back of her throat close. The main room served as kitchen, living area, and what appeared to be sleeping space, mattresses covered in stained sheets piled in corners. But it was the photographs that caught Margaret's attention, dozens of them tacked to the walls in no particular order. Yellowed images dating back decades. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she began to notice something deeply disturbing about these family portraits. The faces repeated, not just family resemblance, but the same narrow-set eyes, the same malformed jawlines, the same oddly shaped heads appearing across generations. Children who grew into adults, who had children who looked disturbingly like their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, a closed genetic loop that had been running for longer than Margaret wanted to consider. That's Grandpa Elijah, Dorlin said, pointing to a photograph of a man with the same white-set eyes as her own. And that's Grandma Roth. She was also his sister and his cousin, twice removed and then brought back close, if you understand. Margaret did not understand, and the part of her that did desperately wished it didn't. Where is the children's father, she asked, pulling at her notepad, needing something normal to focus on. Darling's face, already strained, twisted into something that might have been grief or might have been something else entirely. Fern, that's who you're asking about. Fernand Pritchard. As here. Margaret glanced around the dim room. Could I speak with him? He don't talk much no more, Thomas said, his voice high and strained, coming from a throat that seemed to narrow. Not since he went under. Went under? Margaret asked. Sarah kickled, a sand like water going down a broken run. Under the house. Daddy lives under the house now. Been there 3 years, maybe 4. Mommy says he ain't finished dying yet. The room seemed to tilt. Margaret curbed her notepad tighter. I'm sorry. I don't understand. Your father lives beneath the house? Dorlin nodded slowly. He caught sick. Real sick. Fever and shaking. And his mind went soft like butter left in the sun. We thought he was dead. Brought him down below through the trap door in the back room, meant to bury him proper when the ground thawed. But then we heard him moving down there, scratching and breathing. Fernan never could do nothing simple, always had to complicate things. So he's down there still, taking his time about finishing up. Margaret felt her professional training warring with the horror rising in her chest. Maurice, Pritchard, if your husband is alive and beneath this house, he needs immediate medical attention. We need to call an ambulance right now. Ain't alive, Dorlin said matter-of-factly. Ain't dead neither. He's somewhere in between, like this whole family been for longer than anyone can remember. You want to see him? The trapdoor was in the back. Margaret should have left then. She should have walked out of that house, driven straight to the county sheriff, and brought back proper authorities. But something deeper than professional duty compelled her forward, through the dim hallway, past rooms whose purposes she could only guess at, to a small back chamber where a wooden trapdoor was set into the floor. The smell here was overwhelming, that sweet decay mixed with human waste and the mineral scent of earth. Dorlin lifted the trapdoor with surprising ease, revealing a darkness so complete it seemed to have what? A ladder descended into nothing. Fern, Dorlin called down. Caught in visitor. Government lady wants to meet you. The sound that came up from below was not human. It was breath moving through a damaged throat, wet and labored, punctuated by a scratching that could have been fingernails against wood or bone scraping against bone. Margaret's flashlight beam burst the darkness, revealing a packed earth, support beams, and then in the far corner, something that had once been a man. The stories you will find here where others fear to tread, revealing the darkest corners of human existence that history tried to bury. Subscribe now, because the truth is far more disturbing than any fiction. What Margaret Chan discovered beneath the Pritchard has that October day in 1987 would lead to one of the most disturbing investigations in West Virginia social services history. But the true horror was not the man slowly dying in the darkness below, it was the family tree that had produced him. Over the following weeks, as state authorities descended on the property and Fern Pritchard was finally removed from his written tomb, still breathing despite 3 years of neglect, malnutrition, and conditions that should have killed any human being within days. Margaret became obsessed with understanding how such a situation could exist in modern America. The answer lay in genealogy, history, and the particular isolation of Appalachian geography that had led certain families to exist in close genetic loops for generations. The Pritchard family history, pieced together from county records, census data, and the confused testimonies of family members, painted a picture of systematic inbreeding dating back to the early 1800s. The original Pritchard patriarch, Josiah Pritchard, had settled in what would become Micda County in 1823 with his wife Rebecca and their 7 children. The family claimed a hollow deep in the mountains, far from the scattered settlements that would eventually become towns. In those early years, the isolation was geographic. The nearest neighbors were 15 miles away for rough mountain terrain, and winter made travel impossible for months at a time. When the children of Josiah and Rebecca came of marriage age, there simply were no other options. The oldest son, Jeremiah, married his sister, Constance, in a ceremony performed by their father. The county had no record of it. No church sanctioned it. But in the hollow where the Pritchards lived, it became fact. They produced 6 children, 3 of whom survived adulthood, all showing signs of what we now understand as inbreeding debris. The family history from that point forward read like a genetic nightmare, a closed loop of first cousin marriages, nakedness unions, and in several documented cases, but child relationships that produced offspring with increasingly severe physical and cognitive impairments. The Pritchard family tree was not a tree at all, but a tangled vine that looped back on itself can, each generation more compromised than the last. Dr. Hal Bryan, the geneticist brought in by the state to evaluate the surviving family members, spent 3 months analyzing blood samples, constructing family histories, and documenting the physical manifestations of what he called the most extreme case of sustained consanguinity in American medical literature. His report, which remained sealed by court order until 2015, contained photographs and medical data that shocked even hardened professionals. Vernon Pritchard, the man found beneath the house, was the product of 5 generations of inbreeding so severe that his genetic diversity was comparable to that of someone whose parents were identical twins. His mother, Claire, had been both his father's sister and his cousin, the result of a union between her parents, who were themselves siblings. Vernon's wife, Dorleen, was his second cousin, his niece, and his half-sister, a relationship so complicated that even geneticists struggled to calculate the exact coefficient of inbreeding. Their children, Thomas and Sarah, were among the most inbred individuals ever medically documented in the United States. Thomas had an IQ measured at 45, severe skeletal abnormalities including a curved spine and partially fused vertebrae, heart defects, and a condition called mandibular hypoplasy that made eating and speaking difficult. Sarah was deaf in 1 year, had vision problems due to malformed optic nerves, possessed only 7 fingers total across both hands, and showed signs of early onset dementia at the age 14. But the physical manifestations were only part of the story. What truly disturbed the investigators was the cultural normalization of these relationships within the Pritchard family. When interviewed separately, family members spoke of unequal marriages as keeping the bloodline pure, of brother-sister unions as making sure the land stays in the family, of the practice of older male relatives breaking in younger female relatives as a twisted rite of passage that had been occurring for generations. Dorlin Pritchard, when asked why she had married her relative Fernan despite their close blood relationship, responded with genuine confusion. Who else would I marry? Everybody in these mountains is kin somehow. Fernan was a good man before he got sick. He provided. He was gentle with the children mostly. And nobody's business what happens in a family. The county records revealed that this attitude was not unique to the Pritchards. Micda County, one of the poorest and most isolated regions in West Virginia, had dozens of families with similar histories, though few as extreme. The combination of geographic isolation, poverty that prevented travel and outside marriage, cultural distrust of outsiders, and in some cases a deliberate choice to keep property and resources within bloodlines, had created pockets of severe inbreeding throughout the Appalachian region. Fernan Pritchard's deterioration, according to his family, had begun in 1984. He had always been sickly, prone to infections and seizures, his immune system compromised by his genetic heritage. At age 40, he developed what the family described as a wasting sickness, losing weight rapidly, suffering from fevers and confusion. In any normal situation, he would have been taken to a hospital, but the Pritchards had not sought outside medical care in 3 generations, relying instead on home remedies, prayer, and a fatalistic acceptance of suffering that seemed bred into them as surely as their physical deformities. When Fernan finally collapsed in the late fall of 1984, unresponsive and barely breathing, the family assumed he had died. According to Dorlin's testimony, they wrapped him in a blanket and placed him in the crawl space beneath the house through the trap door, intending to bury him when the ground thawed in spring. But winter was harsh that year, lasting well into April, and by the time the ground was soft enough to deck, Dorlin claimed she could hear movement below. I thought it was rats at first, she told investigators, her face flat and emotionless, but then I heard him cough. Fernan had a particular cough, kind of wet and rattling. I knew it was him. Opened that trap door and shined a light down, and there he was, sitting up against the foundation stones, looking at me with eyes that weren't quite right anymore. He tried to say something, but it just came out as noise. I closed the door. Didn't know what else to do. For 3 years, Fernan Pritchard existed in the darkness beneath his own house, in conditions that defied medical explanation. He survived on whatever scraps of wood Dorlin occasionally threw down through the trap door, on water that dripped through the floorboards when it rained, on sheer biological stubbornness that even Dior Brennan could not fully explain. When he was finally brought up into the late 1987, he weighed 82 pounds. His muscles had atrophied to the point where he could not stand. His skin was covered in sores and fungal infections, and his mind was so far gone that he could not recognize his own children. He would die 6 weeks later in a Charleston hospital, never having regained the ability to speak coherently, his body finally giving up what it should have surrendered years earlier. The investigation into the Pritchard family expanded rapidly once state authorities understood the scope of what they were dealing with. More corruption, now working alongside state police, genealogists, and medical professionals, began mapping the family connections throughout Mikda County and the surrounding region. What they discovered was not a single isolated family, but an interconnected network of related clans whose bloodlines had been mixing and remixing for over a century and a half, creating a genetic catastrophe that had been hiding in plain sight in one of America's most fertile regions. The mountains had kept their secrets well. The hollows and valleys of southern West Virginia were home to families with names like Whitaker, Fuqua, Combs, and Pritchard, families who had lived in virtual isolation since before the Civil War. Many had descended from the same small crop of settlers who had moved into the region in the early 1800s, and with limited options for outside marriage, they had intermarried repeatedly across generations. County marriage records when they existed showed a dizzying array of first cousin unions, second cousin marriages, and relationships that were even closer. But these official records only told a part of the story. Many of the most problematic unions had never been officially registered, occurring within families who did not trust government record keeping and preferred to handle such matters privately. The practice had created what geneticists would later term genetic islands, populations so isolated and interrelated that they had developed unique genetic signatures found nowhere else in the world. Some of these signatures were benign, unusual but harmless variations. Others were devastating. The Fuqua family, living 30 miles from the Pritchard homestead, had become known locally as the Blue People, due to a condition called methemoglobinemia that gave their skin a distinct blue tint, a recessive genetic disorder that had spread through the family due to repeated intermarriage. The Whitaker family, documented in the early 2000s, showed similar patterns of severe inbreeding with multiple generations of individuals suffering from cognitive impairments, physical deformities, and social isolation. But the Pritchards represented perhaps the most extreme example, a family that had taken the practice to its ultimate conclusion. Thomas Pritchard, 9 car following his removal from the family home, spoke hauntingly to counselors about his understanding of family relationships. His testimony, recorded over multiple sessions and transcribed with difficulty due to his speech impediments, provided a window into how these relationships were perceived from inside the closed system. Mom said we were special, Thomas explained, his twisted hands gesturing awkwardly as he struggled to form words. Said our blood was pure, not mixed up with outsiders who didn't understand our ways. She said Daddy was her uncle and her cousin and her brother in different ways. That it all got confusing, but it didn't matter because we was all Pritchards and Pritchards took care of their own. I asked her once why me and Sarah looked different from kids I seen in town when we went for supplies, why we couldn't do things as they could do, and she said it was because we was closer to code, that we was tested special. Sarah Pritchard, undergoing treatment for her various medical conditions at a state facility, provided similar accounts, though her cognitive impairments made communication even more difficult. What emerged from years of patient interviews was a picture of a family culture that had completely normalized relationships that would be criminal in any other context, that had reframed genetic disaster as defined testing, that had created an entire worldview to justify and perpetuate practices that were destroying them generation by generation. The house itself yielded further horrors as investigators conducted a thorough search. The crawl space where Fern had been left to languish contained makeshift bedding, suggesting he had spent the years in a semi-conscious state of survival, eating insects, rats, and whatever minimal food his wife provided. But more disturbing was what they found in the walls. Hidden in a sealed section of the basement were the remains of 3 infants wrapped in rotting cloth, their tiny bones showing signs of severe deformities. Dorlin, when confronted with this discovery, explained with the same flat effect that had characterized all her statements that these had been babies born to her infant, who weren't right, who had died shortly after birth or had been helped along, when it became clear they would not survive. Wasn't no point in getting authorities involved, she said. Baby days, you put it to rest. That's how it's always been done. My mommy had 6 babies who didn't make it, and her mommy before that had even more. When the blood gets too close, sometimes the babies weren't strong enough. It's God's way of thinning things out. The casual horror of this statement, delivered with a different emotional weight, was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire investigation. Here was a woman who had left her husband to die slowly in darkness, who had buried infant children in the walls of her house, who had raised surviving children in conditions of neglect and deprivation, and who seemed genuinely confused about why anyone would find any of this problematic. Dr. Ellen Rodriguez, the psychologist assigned to evaluate the surviving Pritchard family members, struggled to categorize what she was seeing. This is not psychopathy in the traditional sense, she wrote in her report. There is no evidence of sadistic pleasure in causing suffering, no manipulation or calculated cruelty. Instead, what we see is a complete absence of the normal human framework for understanding family care and appropriate boundaries. Generations of isolation and inbreeding have created not just physical and cognitive impairments, but a kind of cultural and emotional inbreeding as well. These individuals are operating within a closed system that has its own internal logic, one that bears little resemblance to the outside world. The community response to the Pritchard case was complex and troubling. While some locals expressed shock and called for justice, many others were defensive, arguing that the Pritchards should have been left alone, that they were being prosecuted for mountain was that outsiders didn't understand. Several families with similar histories quietly withdrew their children from school and became even more isolated, fearing that they would be next to face state intervention. At a community meeting held in the McDonough County Courthouse, tensions ran high. "You government people come in here thinking you know what's best," shouted one man, who identified himself only as rural. "These families been in these mountains longer than your agencies existed. They caught their own ways. Ain't perfect maybe, but they survive. Now you want to report families, both people and institutions, tell us how to live. This is exactly why we don't trust outsiders." Others pushed back against this attitude. "My grandparents came from these same mountains," said local teacher Beatrice Halbrook, her voice shaking with emotion. "And they caught it. They married outside the family. They gave their children a chance at a normal life. What happened to the Pritchards isn't tradition. It's tragedy. Those children deserve better. Fernand Pritchard deserved better than to die in darkness under his own house. We can't hide behind mountain pride when we're talking about the people suffering." The debate revealed deep divisions within Appalachian communities about tradition, privacy, outside interference, and what obligations society has to intervene in family situations even when those families are isolated and suspicious of help. Now, as you hear Thomas's words echoing in your mind about being closer to code and tested special, I want you to pause and think about the children born into circumstances they never chose. If these words have moved you, if you feel the weight of this tragedy, leave a comment right now with these exact words that Thomas spoke: "We was closer to code, tested special." Let me see who's truly listening to these forgotten voices. The prosecution of Dorlin Pritchard would become a landmark case in West Virginia legal history, raising questions about criminal culpability, mental competency, and the extent to which someone could be held responsible for actions committed within a closed cultural system they had never left. The charges were severe. 3 counts of concealment of death for the infants found in the walls, felony neglect resulting in serious bodily harm for her treatment of Fern, and multiple counts of child endangerment for the conditions in which Thomas and Sari had been raised. Darling's court-appointed attorney, Marcus Webb, faced an almost impossible task. His client could barely understand the proceedings, spoke in a dialect so thick that court reporters struggled to transcribe her testimony accurately, and showed no apparent comprehension that her actions were considered criminal. She has the intellectual capacity of someone who is mildly cognitively impaired, way borcued during competency hearings. Her entire life has been spent in an environment where the practices she engaged in were considered normal, even necessary. She has never attended school, never had exposure to medical care, never had any interaction with the world beyond a 5-mile radius of her birthplace. How can we hold her to standards she has never been taught? The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Dennis Thornton, argued that ignorance of the law was no excuse, particularly when the suffering was so extreme. Fernand Pritchard spent 3 years dying in darkness beneath his own home while his wife lived above him, Thornton stated in her opening arguments. She heard him down there. She occasionally threw scraps of wood through the trap door like he was an animal. She made a conscious choice every single day not to seek help, not to end his suffering, to let him waste away in conditions that fail at every standard of human decency. And the children, raised in filth and neglect, denied education, medical care, any chance at a normal life. The defendant may come from an isolated background, but she knew her husband was suffering. She knew her children were suffering, and she chose to do nothing. The trial, which lasted 3 weeks in the spring of 1989, became a media sensation, drawing national attention to the issues of poverty, isolation, and inbreeding in Appalachia. News crews descended on Micda County, interviewing locals, filming the abandoned Pritchard homestead, creating sensationalized segments about America's hidden genetic disasters. The coverage was often exploitative, focusing on the most shocking details while ignoring the complex historical and socio-economic factors that had created the situation. To understand how the Pritchard case came to be required looking back more than a century and a half of Appalachian history. The region's isolation was not accidental, but the result of deliberate geographic and economic factors. When settlers first moved into the Appalachian Mountains in the early 1800s, they were often fleeing death, legal troubles, or simply seeking land they could claim for from established authority. The mountains provided that refuge, but at a cost. The terrain made farming difficult, limited to small plots in valleys and hollows. Roads were nearly impossible to build and maintain. Towns were few and far between. Families settled in isolated pockets, some teams not seeing other people for months at a time. In this environment, traditional social structures broke down. When the nearest church was a desert nearby offered dangerous mountain paths, religious oversight of marriages despaired. When the nearest town was 30 miles of rough official marriage licenses became irrelevant. When your nearest neighbors were already family, the pool of potential marriage partners shrank to nothing. First cousin marriage, illegal in many states, was widely practiced and socially accepted in isolated Appalachian communities throughout the 1800s and well into the 1900s. But some families took it further. The rise of the coal industry in the late 1800s and early 1900s transformed parts of Appalachia but left others, like Micda County's most isolated hollows, largely untouched. While some families moved to coal towns, found work in the mines, and integrated into a broader social world. Others retreated further into the mountains, suspicious of outsiders and industrial change. These families became increasingly isolated, their gene pools shrinking generation by generation. The Pritchard family history mirrored this broader pattern. Genealogical research revealed that by 1900, the family had effectively stopped marrying outside a crop of about 20 individuals spread across 3 generations, all descended from the original Joseph Pritchard. By 1950, that number had shrunk to fewer than 10. By the time Fern and Dorlin married in 1968, they were choosing from a pool of potential partners that consisted entirely of relatives with coefficients of relatedness that would have made geneticists shudder. Dr. Lawrence Mitchell, a historian specializing in Appalachian culture, testified during the Pritchard trial about this historical context. What we see in families like the Pritchards is the end result of systemic abandonment, he explained. These were communities that the broader society essentially forgot. No schools, no medical care, no infrastructure, no economic opportunity. They were left to survive on their own. And they developed survival strategies that seemed to make sense in their isolated context but that had devastating long-term consequences. We cannot understand the Pritchard case without understanding that it is a case of societal failure as much as individual choices. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning a mixed verdict. Dorlin Pritchard was found guilty of 3 counts of concealment of death and 2 counts of felony neglect, but was found not competent to stand trial on the endangerment charges due to her cognitive limitations. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but was transferred to a state psychiatric facility after it became clear that she could not function in a general prison population. Thomas and Sarah Pritchard became wards of the state. Thomas was placed in a group home specializing in adults with developmental disabilities, where he would spend the rest of his life never fully understanding why his family had been torn apart. Sarah, whose medical needs were more severe, was placed in a long-term care facility where she received treatment for her various conditions, but never adapted to life outside the isolated world she had known for her first 14 years. She died in 2003 at age 30 from complications related to her congenital conditions, having never learned to read, never experienced normal social relationships, never knowing anything beyond the narrow confines of either the Pritchard homestead or the institutional settings that followed. The Pritchard has stood empty 4 years after the family was removed, a sacking monument to generational tragedy in the West Virginia mountains. Locals avoided it, not out of supernatural fear, but from a deep discomfort with what it represented. The property was eventually seized by the county for unpaid taxes and demolished in 1995. The contaminated soil beneath scraped away and the site left to return to forest. But the story did not end with the destruction of the building or the scattering of the family. The case prompted a broader examination of inbreeding in isolated American communities, leading to genetic studies, public health initiatives, and difficult conversations about the balance between cultural autonomy and the duty to protect vulnerable individuals. Dr. Herb Bryan, the geneticist who had studied the Pritchard family, spent the remaining years of his career researching the genetic impacts of sustained consanguinity. His work, published in multiple peer-reviewed journals, provided some of the most comprehensive data ever collected on the subject. The Pritchard family represents an extreme on a spectrum that affects thousands of individuals in isolated communities across America, Bryan wrote in his landmark 1992 paper. The genetic impacts of inbreeding are well documented. Increased rates of recessive genetic disorders, reduced immune function, higher infant mortality, cognitive impairments, and physical deformities. But what the Pritchard case revealed was how these genetic impacts can interact with social isolation, poverty, and lack of education to create a cycle that becomes self-perpetuating. Each generation is less capable of breaking out of the pattern than the last, until you reach a point where individuals like Dorlin Pritchard simply do not have the cognitive or emotional capacity to recognize that anything is wrong. The public health response in Micda County and similar regions involved that rich programs, genetic counseling, education about the dangers of consanguineous relationships, and efforts to connect isolated families with medical and social services. But the programs faced significant challenges. Many families remained deeply suspicious of outside intervention, viewing it as an attack on their way of life. Some communities circled the wagons, protecting their own against what they saw as judgmental outsiders who did not understand mountain culture. The tension between respecting cultural autonomy and protecting individuals from harm remained unresolved. In the years following the Pritchard trial, several other similar cases came to light in Appalachia and other isolated regions. Each case revealed the same pattern: geographic isolation, poverty, cultural insularity, and repeated intermarriage creating pockets of genetic disaster. The most infamous was the Whitaker family case documented extensively in the early 2000s, which showed similar patterns of inbreeding and isolation, though without the specific horror of a family member left to die beneath the house. Thomas Pritchard lived until 2018, spending 31 years in institutional care. Staff members reported that he never fully adjusted to his new life, that he would often speak about wanting to go home to the mountains, that he never understood why he could not see his mother or sister. In his final years, suffering from the heart defects that had plagued him since birth, he would tell anyone who would listen about the house in the hollow, about his father who lived under the floor, about a life that seemed almost mythical and how removed it was from the reality around him. Margaret Chen, the social worker who had first discovered the Pritchard situation, left social services in 1991, burned out by what she had witnessed. In interviews given years later, she reflected on the case that had defined and ultimately ended her career. What haunts me is not just what I saw, but the knowledge that Fern Pritchard's suffering could have been prevented at so many points, Chen said in a 2010 interview. If there had been better social services in that region, if the family had not been so isolated, if there had been education about the dangers of inbreeding, if there had been economic opportunities that might have encouraged people to move outside their narrow geographical and social circles. Fernan was born into a genetic trap that had been generations in the making. He never had a chance at a normal life. And then turned his days in darkness, slowly dying beneath his own house while his family went about their lives above him. That is a horror that stays with you. The broader scientific and social understanding of the impacts of inbreeding has evolved significantly since the Pritchard case. Modern genetics can now precisely calculate the risks associated with consanguineous relationships, can screen for recessive genetic disorders, can counsel families about the dangers. But knowledge alone cannot solve the problem when it is embedded in communities that lack access to that knowledge, that distrust those who offer it, or that face such limited options that risky relationships seem preferable to no relationships at all. The Pritchard case also sparked conversations about how America treats its most isolated and forgotten communities. Micda County, where the Pritchards lived, remains one of the poorest counties in the United States, with limited economic opportunities, ongoing struggles with substance abuse, and persistent geographic isolation. The conditions that created the Pritchard tragedy have not fundamentally changed. Though increased connectivity through the internet and better roads have reduced some of the extreme isolation that characterized earlier generations. Some descendants of the broader Pritchard family line still live in West Virginia, though most have moved away from the most isolated hollows and have married outside the narrow family circle. They carry with them a complex legacy, a family history that is difficult to acknowledge but impossible to forget. One such descendant, Rebecca Morris, born Rebecca Pritchard in 1985, shared her perspective in a 2019 interview. I grew up knowing there was something wrong with my family history, but nobody would talk about it directly, Morrison said. There were whispers about relatives who were slow or deformed, about babies who died, about people who lived in conditions that nobody wanted to describe. When I was 16, I finally asked my grandmother directly what everyone was avoiding, and she told me about Fern, about Dorlin, about the house, and what had happened there. I felt such shame, like I was carrying this genetic curse. It took years of therapy to understand that I am not defined by what previous generations did, that I could break the cycle. But it is hard. The stigma around Appalachian families, the assumptions people make, the way we are portrayed in media as backward and inbred, it affects real people. People who are trying to build normal lives but who carry the weight of history they did not create. The story of Fern Pritchard, the husband who never finished dying, is ultimately a story about the consequences of isolation, of what happens when families are cut off from broader society for generations. When poverty and geography conspire to create closed systems, when genetic loops tighten until they strangle. It is a story about a man who spent years dying in darkness while life went on above him. About children born into circumstances that doomed them from conception. About a woman so damaged by generational trauma and inbreeding that she could no longer distinguish care from cruelty. As of 2025, the site where the Pritchard house once stood is marked only by a slight depression in the forest floor, a few foundation stones visible among the vegetation. No plaque commemorates what happened there. No historical marker explains the tragedy. The mountains have reclaimed this space, covering the evidence of human suffering with green growth. But the story endures, a dark reminder of what can happen when the people are forgotten. When isolation becomes absolute, when bloodlines turn back on themselves too many times, creating not family trees, but genetic prisons from which there is no escape. Fern Pritchard was the product of 5 generations of systematic inbreeding. Married to a woman who was simultaneously his cousin, niece, and sister. He spent his final years in conditions of unimaginable suffering, forgotten beneath his own home, a living testament to the culmination of genetic and social catastrophe. His story is not one of ghosts or supernatural curses, but of something far more disturbing. The very real consequences of human choices, social abandonment, and the breaking of genetic and moral boundaries that exist for reasons written in biology itself. If you watched until here, it means this story moved you. Leave a comment saying, I watched until here, so I can get to know you and know who truly appreciates the stories on this channel. And if this investigation into one of America's darkest family secrets impacted you, hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that the most disturbing stories are the ones rooted in reality, not fiction. These forgotten voices, these buried truths, they deserve to be heard. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because there are more stories like this. More truths that society tried to hide in the shadows of poverty and isolation. More accounts that will make you question what happens in the forgotten corners of our country. Thank you for bearing witness to Fern Pritchard's story, to the Pritchard family's tragedy, and to a base of American history that most would prefer to forget.